Greetings all. This is our third in our series called NARALO Insights. It's a program that has been developed by myself, Glenn McKnight, who's the secretary of NARALO, and Eduardo Diaz, who's the chair of NARALO. We have a special guest today, and Michael Casadevall, who will be talking about the DNS. So I'm going to turn it over to Eduardo.
Good evening or morning or whatever to everyone. Basically, today's insight is around the DOS technologies, and DOS stands for DNS over Transport Layer Security, TLS, or DNS over HTTPS. There was a session in COVID in ICANN 65, I believe it was, there was a session about this technology there. And there were a couple of reports made in a large about people that went to this session. And it occurs to us that this is a very interesting topic to have an insight. And we invited Michael today, who is an expert in the DNS arena. And because we want to answer a basic question. If this is a new technology that can impact the stability and security of the DNS system. And that's the ICANN mission. That's basically what we like to know. And during the conversation today, we want for answers to the following questions. Can these technologies impact the end user and how? Do end user benefits from this? Is the end user required to understand this? Which one is better? Can we use both indistinctly? And whatever other questions and insights Michael can bring in will be so Michael, please.
So I guess taking it from the top, DNS over TLS and DNS over HTTPS are an effort to provide end-to-end security from the end user to the DNS resolver. DNS today is unencrypted, and basically anyone can manipulate or listen to traffic in flight. So it's a major privacy concern in that regards. And these two specifications are trying to fix it. Unfortunately, the way they exist today makes real world deployment of these technologies somewhat difficult. And it can have a negative impact on both the end user and deploying corporations. I lost the audio. Eduardo, you're still muted.
I'm sorry. Can you explain why does this affect the end user? I mean,
So the largest problem is that DNS, so host names on the internet require DNS to resolve. For DNS over TLS or DNS over HTTPS to be deployed, you need an SSL certificate. SSL certificates traditionally are issued to host names and not IP addresses, and they cannot be issued to what we call RFC 1918 space. That's what's called private LANs. So you can't deploy this technology trivially within a corporate network or within a home network without setting up what's known as a private certificate of authority, and then that adds a lot of hoops. You could use public servers, for example, Google and Cloudflare, just to name two, offer this service, but it's still dependent on making sure that traffic is not being black holed or man in the middle.
Can you explain that? I don't understand what that terminology is.
No problem. So because basically, because there's only a small number of public DNS resolvers, it is possible for a third-party actor to do what's known as a black hole, where they can force traffic to a given host to simply not go through and deny services. This is what's known as the denial of service attacks. It's been used, it's also used in certain corporate networks to limit information going out. So, and then you're also required to take it, to trust these companies and hope that they are doing DNS correctly, on your behalf, the role of the recursive resolver. So it would allow corporation, if you use a public resolver, you're giving up a lot of privacy information to the company that runs that resolver.
Okay, so it seems to me from what you're saying is that doesn't only affect the end user in some sense, but it makes what I want to hear this. If I tell my mother to use this, is it something that she needs to know? Is it something that this happens magically in the background? Do you have to do something to make it happen?
So as of this moment right now, the answer is yes. Firefox and I believe Chrome have this support built into it, but it's not enabled out of the box. Major operating systems, Windows, Mac OS X, and Linux, do not currently support DNS over TLS or DNS over HTTPS out of the box. You need additional third-party software to use it. Now, this will likely change over time as these standards are still very new, but it's not something that's just going to work magically out of the box, no configuration required as of this moment.
So when you say that Firefox and Chrome, they have it incorporated in their software, but it's not enabled, I mean, if this is a better technology for, it encrypts the information, why don't they do it? I mean, will it affect the way people browse through the internet? Will they notice something different if they enable it as a default?
So there's a privacy concern here. So when you're using your local router or your ISP router, they're the ones that see all your DNS requests. If you turn on support for DOH or DOT, then Cloudflare or Google gets to see every single DNS request you make. So there's a significant privacy concern there. And as I previously mentioned, deploying these technologies on a local network is difficult. There's also the problem that if DOH or DOT is enabled and it's pointing to Google or Cloudflare and not to your own networks resolvers, you can have unintended side effects. For example, if you did this in a corporate LAN, you would lose access to anything on the local LAN's address space because split horizon DNS is very common in corporate networks. And just as an explanation, split horizon DNS is essentially DNS entries that are not visible to the world. They only exist within a corporate network or local network. It's not recommended practice, but it is unfortunately very common.
So let me ask you a question. If, like I'm an end user, I'm in my home, I have a Wi-Fi system, I have like 3 routers here, and I connect to the internet. So if I start using this, will I have a problem? I'm not in a corporation or I don't know if having a local area network here, I'm just using Wi-Fi. I'm not a network guy. Will I have problems connecting to the internet and surfing in that scenario?
You may. It mostly depends on the application in question. For example, my router here at home, I go to fiosrouter.com, and that actually redirects to the configuration page of the router instead of an actual website. That won't work if DOH/DOT is enabled. And there's other devices that work like that, sort of as a magic box. DOH/DOT also, as only covers encryption for the first hop. So, it basically, you're trading off a bunch of DNS server, your ISP seeing your DNS request to a third-party company. And I sort of question how much security this gives in practice because DOH/DOT now requires that you have to connect to third-party resolvers instead. It mostly affects you because it could prevent certain things on your network from working correctly because the browser will not see the same DNS requests or may not see the same DNS requests as the rest of the system. This can affect things like universal plug and play, local multicast discovery, and other devices that basically work plug and play on a network.
Okay, so from what I'm hearing, it definitely will affect the users somehow.
If it's enabled.
But in if all these hurdles are fixed somehow in the future, it really will benefit all of us because because of the fact that DNS is not encrypted at the moment, right? So it will be something to our benefits once we know we can use it to browse and do whatever we want to do in the internet.
See, that's the second problem with the specification. While it does encrypt DNS traffic, it doesn't authenticate it. So DNSSEC is the way we authenticate traffic for DNS today. It has got the fundamental flaw that the recursive resolver has to be trusted to validate it. The end user basically is crossing their fingers and hoping nothing is lying. If you're using DOH/DOT, there is nothing stopping the recursive resolver from lying and making it look like it's a true answer. Like if your ISP is filtering or blocklisting a site, DOH/DOT does not guarantee you're getting accurate DNS records. In some ways, it creates a false sense of security. At best, all it prevents is eavesdropping of DNS requests, and then only to passive observers.
So, if that's the case, why are people talking about this technology? I mean, it sounded, when you looked at it, it sounded like a solution to a problem of eavesdropping and stuff like that. But in the end, you can still get garbage, right? Is that what you're saying?
That's essentially the case. And the problem is that these technologies simply didn't go far enough. They basically take the existing 1980s DNS protocol, throw a level of encryption on it, and call it good. Without validating DNSSEC on the client's computer, there's no way to know that the records are accurate. And then you have to also deal with the unfortunate truth is that DNSSEC deployment, while growing, is still relatively small. And DNSSEC can be stripped. There's no, there's nothing. It's just a very ugly catch-22. I feel like these technologies create a false sense of security than actual security.
So, this sounds very, very complicated. Can you give us an example how this technology works in your own words? Is it something like, when I send an HTTPS request, it somehow gets involved in the request and it passed through to this Google or one of those new DNS resolvers that will look at this and decipher where I want to go, right?
Okay. The easiest way to explain this is to walk through how this connection happens with normal DNS and then explain the differences. So in a normal DNS scenario, let's say that you're going to icann.org. What'll happen is that your computer has a list of names of what's called recursive resolvers. Those handle the heavy lifting of DNS lookup. And typically, that's either your router or something your ISP is hosting. That's the most typical small, home and small office scenario. So you would get a request for icann.org, and then it will return you the IPv4 or IPv6 addresses. Then your computer can make a connection to icann.org, and then it does what's called a TLS handshake. That's Transport Layer Security Handshake, where a set of signed certificates are exchanged, validated, and then encryption is established. Trust in in TLS comes from what's known as certificate authority, something I will touch on more later. But if there's a valid chain from if the certificate authority has signed ICANN.org's certificate, it's assumed to be valid, and then the connection goes through. The certificates can be revoked or expired, though, in the case of compromise or non-renewal. So that's how it works today in a non-DNS, and with let's say old style DNS. In the DNS over TLS and DNS over HTTPS, because in this regard, they're essentially identical. What happens is that when you make the request for ICANN.org, instead of talking to your router or your ISP, you reach one of the open resolvers on the internet, at least as of writing. And then you do the TLS handshake with that. So your computer validates the DNS resolver's certificate. And then if that passes, it then it does a secure handshake, sends DNS traffic there, gets it back, and then the second part happens identically. So that's more or less how it works in a nutshell.
From the standpoint of communicating bandwidth, is there will the end user see a significant delay in responding to your request by using DOH versus the current DNS, or it's something that happens very fast? You see what?
There is considerably more overhead because both technologies require what's known as a TCP/IP connection, which has a fairly lengthy setup and teardown time. It's probably not noticeable in most cases, but if you're dealing with an intermittent connection, it may cause some lag, although it's probably on the order of milliseconds in most scenarios, unless it's a very poor connection.
So, in your own opinion, what is, knowing what this technology does today and the DNS, the way it works today, which one you think is better? If knowing both technologies, will you keep the DNS the way it is, or will you take this technology and bring it the specifications to something more robust?
So that's a pretty difficult question to answer. So let me break it down in multiple steps. As far as DNS over TLS versus DNS over HTTPS, they essentially provide the same level of security. But DNS over HTTPS has certain characteristics that could be problematic in practice. Specifically, it makes it possible for browser JavaScript to do arbitrary DNS requests in a way that can be very difficult to detect. And that actually can be used in a way to create tracking cookies by having the web browser look up arbitrary DNS keys and then recording the lookups on another server. So that is a concern with DNS over HTTPS. But an advantage of this technology is it will work in almost any setup because it's essentially a standard secure web page. It doesn't require opening up a different port, and it'll go through most restrictive firewalls.
That was me.
Yep.
Sorry.
That's fine. DNS over TLS is a cleaner solution, but on the whole, they're more or less equivalent.
Okay. So, Glenn, if you want to interrupt and have your own questions, please do so. So, to wrap up this whole thing, is this technology something that you will consider that will impact the stability and security of the DNS system the way it is today?
Unfortunately, yes. The largest problem we have is that it inherently ties together DNS to what's known as the Web PKI, or public key infrastructure. Those are the series of certificate authorities I spoke about earlier. The problem here is that the PKI ecosystem is extremely complex and has certain difficulties in handling certain aspects, the largest of which is that key revocation is a difficult thing to do correctly. Without going into the details of TLS and its underlying technology, there are certain cases where you are stuck with a situation that you cannot validate if a key is or is not revoked, and then this leads to an ugly catch-22: is do you trust that a public certificate if you cannot determine the revocation status? As we've seen in the DNSSEC world, we've seen misconfigurations and failures cause DNSSEC records to erroneously validate or erroneously fail. We are now adding an incredibly complex system on top of DNS and adding a lot more failure states that can possibly go wrong. So in that regard, I do have concerns on the stability of DNS over TLS and DNS over HTTPS. Although on the flip side, I don't think there's a better alternative to this, and it may just be a cost that we have to accept if we want encrypted DNS in any form.
So this is an hypothetical question. Let's say this technology gets more robust or what have you, and gets implemented in browsers. Will that make ICANN's remit disappear in some sense? I mean, or do we need to still keep the DNS running at the root level so this whole thing works? Do you have an opinion on that? In that hypothetical question.
So these two technologies don't change how DNS works. It still requires that the root servers exist, that ICANN administers the DNSSEC KSK and all the quote unquote technical functions that ICANN performs for the root servers. Where it makes things a little bit more difficult is if use of DNS over TLS and DNS over HTTPS extends to the top level domains and to the root servers, because there is a valid argument for deploying those technologies at that level. But then you've got you have to determine what certificate authorities are going to be allowed for this. Is ICANN going to run its own certificate authority? It may very well could end up in a ugly rabbit hole where ICANN either has to extend its remit or has to extend its policy if this technology ever extends beyond the recursive resolver to the authoritative name server or to the root zone.
Okay, Glenn, if you have any question, I'll wrap it up.
This is quite intriguing, and I have to go back to the ICANN Learn to See what materials are there to complement what you're saying. Going beyond ICANN, the other alphabet soup, the ISOCs of the world, the IETFs or ARINs, all those organizations that are deeply involved, are they committed to education, or what are they doing in order to assist people to try to grapple and come to grips with this issue? And the other part of this is, what can the end users, or NARALO and at-large community members, what can they do in order to bring themselves up to speed on this for themselves as well as their communities?
As far as our ARIN goes, it's not in their remit because they operate on a level below DNS because they're dealing with IP numbers directly. I'm not familiar with any material coming out of ISOC, although that's not to say there isn't. These technologies only recently got out of the drafting stage at the IETF. So aside from the experimental test servers and there's very little on it in the real world as of right now. Now, I have a series of slides and talking about them more in depth that I'm happy to place under Creative Commons as educational. But the large problem to deal here with is that to understand DNS over TLS and DNS over HTTPS, you also have to understand Web PKI, which drastically increases the learning curve here, because now you have to go down the rabbit hole of secure certificate authorities, revocation, key rotation. Basically, if you thought DNSSEC into the KSK was complicated, this is an entirely additional level of complication and three-letter acronyms everywhere. So I would think that having a basic primer to TLS, which probably exists in these communities, and then merging that with DNS into one comprehensive document would be very good for the community to understand the, shall we say, pitfalls, the pros and the pitfalls that come with these technologies.
Great, thank you. Yeah, if you can get to us the slides, so if you can host them somewhere, then I can put a link in the video. That would be great.
I'll send you what I have right now. They're more geared to explaining DNS hijacking, so I need to probably cut them down.
Okay.
Because that was the talk I gave at IFF, and then I did a follow-up to that talk that wanted to hear more about these technologies. So I'm just getting, they're a Google slide deck. I'm just looking for them. They're under Creative Commons attribution. I can put them under CC0 so NARALO can use them freely.
Perfect.
Okay.
Back to you, Eduardo.
So thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Michael. This, I think, we got all the answers to the questions that we had. I think this insight will help people to understand what some of the issues are, especially from the end user part. And I'm pretty sure this insight will help open some of the discussion on it. You know, it will help to have deeper discussions of this. Going forward, this is something that's going to be, like I said, going to be discussed in Marrakesh. And Michael, you're going to